Greetings, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this video is about George Galloway, and I'm going to make this one because one of my many faithful viewers requested that I make it, and I'm that sort of chap, so I respond to these requests. Now, this is about George Galloway. So who is Comrade Galloway? He's best known as having been a standard bearer of the far left in the United Kingdom for a quarter of a century or more. He was born in the 1950s. I make it a point of honor not to look things up before I do these. So I can't tell you the exact year. I'm going to estimate 1954. Anyway, so he was born in the United Kingdom, in the city of Dundee. That's where he grew up. He's, let me see, he's partly Scots, partly Irish. As he said, his grandmother is an O'Reilly. She was a going concern a few years ago when Comrade Galloway appeared on Bill O'Reilly's show on Fox News, The O'Reilly Factor. And I know this because George Galloway happened to bring it up. Incidentally, his surname is the name of a Scots county close to the English border. But what else about Gorgeous George? Great name, by the way. So, yeah, he's a far-left firebrand. Would he call himself far-left? I'm not so sure. He would definitely say he was a man of the left. Probably one of the true great achievements in his lifetime is to meet me. How about that? But my word, that's 19 years ago in the Oxford Union. And he was talking about imperialism, saying, some of you may be people of the right and think that we have a right to establish colonies all across the globe. And a voice piped up, well, why don't we? But that was a friend of mine. I shan't say his name. No, that's not an alias for my good self. But I happen to be a man of the left, and I think that imperialism is morally repugnant and an absolute disgrace to the human race, or something like that. Am I overdoing the Caledonian burr? Perhaps. But he has the most fabulous timbre and prosody when it comes to oration. The way there'll be the rising and falling tone and a tone of rising moral indignation, like that. And they don't do it like that anymore. I think they broke the mold when he was born. So he harks back to a previous generation of socialist orators. So he's self-righteous in spades. He's pugnacious. He adds to the gaiety of the nation, though I disagree with him very strongly on many issues. Hello there, Diane Malloy. So what a tone of voice he has, and he's imbued with this seemingly limitless self-assurance. So he grew up in a proletarian family. He gravitated towards the Labour Party, or he suppose he likes to count one of his grandfathers, I think it's on the Irish side, saying, well, that old adage, I can't remember who first came up with this so-called witticism. The British Empire was the one on which the sun never set because God would never trust us in the dark. Okay, since quoted by Dr. Shashi Tharoor, the grand panjandrum of Trivandrum, as in the Congress Party MP for Thiruvananthapuram, that city in India. But actually, that bon mot about the empire upon which the sun never set, as in it circled the globe, that was first said of the Spanish Empire. But there we are. So Galloway, he left school in his teens. He's never received any higher education. Now, does he feel somewhat inadequate about this? I suspect that he does, because obviously by the time he left Parliament, that was only a few years ago, he lost his seat. And my goodness, I can't think about 2015. Almost every MP had a degree, and he's never been anywhere near a university. So is there over-protestation there? Is he rather too keen to establish his intellectual credentials? Perhaps he's insecure in this regard. Anyway, so he was a confrère of John Reed in the 70s. John Reed was, well, actually the Communist Party for a while, and then the Labour Party became a Blairite. No, not John Reed of 10 Days Who Shook the World. Dr. John Reed, he always has himself known by the title doctor on account of his PhD from Stirling University, who was in Blair's cabinet a lot. And Galloway said that John Reed taught the entire IRA songbook to yours truly. So Galloway claims there's a lot of anti-Catholicism in Scotland at the time, and there was some. We could debate just how severe it was, where he claimed that the bank wouldn't employ Catholics even though they didn't actually state it outright. Did Catholics apply? I don't know. Did they apply in significant numbers? I'm not sure. But assuming he's right and that Catholics applied in serious numbers and yet we were rejected, well, that would be a very strong indication that there was sectarian discrimination, not by law, but by some individual businesses. Anyhow, and then when he was a schoolboy, a Catholic boy from his school was awarded a job at this bank, and the headmaster was so elated he granted everyone the day off to celebrate. So he claims that there was a severe and systemic anti-Catholic discrimination in the UK. Now, in Northern Ireland, there was some anti-Catholic discrimination, some anti-Protestant discrimination. What else can I say? Obviously, racial and religious discrimination is a worldwide problem. It's a very long-term problem, and doesn't mean it's a good thing. It ought to be tackled, and I think the UK has gone a very long way towards tackling it. Rather, it doesn't exist at all. Now, some so-called anti-Catholicism is not, like wearing poppies or something. That's what Sinn Féin would have you believe, or what was I going to say? I mean, obviously, Catholics, let's say in Northern Ireland, being less willing to join the Royal Ulster Constabulary or the British Army. So obviously that means we're not going to get those jobs, but some employers would want people, would give preference to those who had served in the military. I'm not saying that no Catholics joined the armed forces or the police. They did, but just not in such numbers. So that was a reason why we were somewhat disadvantaged, but that some of our number made it that way, and blah, blah, blah. So, and partly this is just, it's not what you know, it's who you know, friends or relatives putting in a good word for you. And if you don't have a friend or relative already in there, then you're disadvantaged. But anyway, I digress a little bit. So, yeah, he joined the Labour Party. He got elected to to Dundee City Council. I'm not sure what his job was, actually, but he was always a man who was bristling with opinions. He went bald early in life. He had that moustache. Hello there, Southern number 9 from North America. Do you mean British North America, as we used to call Canada, or do you mean the United States? Anyway, he was an early adherent of the Palestinian national cause. This is back in the early 70s, and it was deeply unfashionable. And the Arabs had just lost the Yom Kippur War. There was the oil shock. The Arab states were decidedly hacked off, with Occidental countries selling weapons to the Zionist entity, as they called it, said, all right, then we're just going to stop producing oil. And within a few months, the oil prices quadrupled. I remember hearing how in Ireland, a lot of people were freewheeling and so on. If you're at the top of the hill, you didn't need to use petrol, just switch the engine off and just go down, take the brake off to try and save petrol. We then got to turn the engine on later, which I would guess somewhat defeats the object of switching the engine off earlier up, because it takes so much petrol to get the engine going again. Anyway, so when he's on Dundee City Council, he tried to form partnerships with Palestinian local authorities and invite dignitaries from their municipalities, hoist the Palestinian flag and so forth, said the Palestinians, they are illegally occupied, they're being brutalized and so on. And a lot of the Labour Party didn't want to hear at this time. Labour Friends of Israel was a fairly dominant faction in the Labour Party. And Labour said, well, the Zionists who founded Israel, they were, a lot of them were socialists. There was a large British Jewish community, many of them Labour voters. And they obviously gave short shrift to people in the Labour Party who were against Israel. I don't think he's opposed to Israel's existence. I could be wrong. He thinks it oughtn't to have been established. Mr. Galloway's view is that the United Kingdom had no right to dispose of Palestine, that Palestine belonged to the Palestinians, not the Ottoman Empire anywhere else. So the Balfour Declaration ought not to have been issued. I actually concur with him on that one. But anyway, it was issued and something needed to be done. Obviously, in the early 70s, the Holocaust was a much more recent memory. There were so many more survivors around at the time. We weren't hearing the Palestinian side of the story. Very few Palestinians could speak English back then. They can now. So what was coming over the airwaves in the Anglosphere were these Israeli voices, often speaking unaccented English, and the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, canny enough, hello there from San Jose, canny enough, if speaking to the United Kingdom, to put forward a British Israeli. People sympathise, oh, that's one of us. You're writing from New York City, where George Galloway is not widely known. Well, George Galloway, he famously testified, I think it was in 2004, before the United States Congress, and there was some sort of documentary about it. Mr. Galloway goes to Washington, and he really fulminated against the Bush administration. He was questioned there, and obviously he was not required to appear there, but he chose to do so, and he castigated the United States government for launching its war in Iraq. Obviously, Galloway, he also absolutely caned his own government, the British government, for getting involved, and on and on. So, yeah, he was in the Labour Party. He was trying to be selected as an MP. In the 1980s, the Labour Party was really down in the mouth. A moderate faction of the Labour Party, about a tenth of its MPs, had decamped, helped form the Social Democratic Party. There was a Conservative Party on the right and the Labour Party on the left. There was the Liberals in the middle, and the SDP broke away from the Labour Party when they issued their Limehouse Declaration in March 1981. But the Liberals and the SDP seemed to agree on quite a lot. So they formed the SDP Liberal Alliance. That's quite a mouthful. Social Democratic Party Liberal Alliance. So they just called it the Alliance for short. And they had two separate parties cooperating. But anyway, Roy Jenkins was the first leader of the Social Democratic Party, formerly a Labour man, son of a Labour MP and a Welsh miner, no less. Roy Jenkins had been Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, was an arch Europhile. But anyway, he was elected in a sensational by-election victory for the SDP in Glasgow Hillhead. Glasgow Hillhead, a seat which Labour had held for 90 years. So this was a disaster of seismic proportions for the Labour Party. If they couldn't hold Glasgow Hillhead, they weren't safe anywhere. Anyway, the SDP, they said they're going to break the mould of British politics. They barely dented it. Their opinion poll ratings were very impressive for a few months in the 80s, but it was the Falklands victory helped Thatcher. You know, the SDP, they helped split the anti-conservative vote. So, but in 1983, the SDP got, 25% of the vote and 24 MPs or something like that. Hello, someone's asking Diane why she's up at such an hour. But 1987, they fell back in their share of the vote, the SDP, and the number of seats. But 1987 is crucially when George Galloway, he retook Glasgow Hillhead for the Labour Party, and Roy Jenkins was out of the House of Commons. He was later ennobled, became Lord Jenkins of Hillhead. If somebody becomes a peer of the realm of the United Kingdom, he or she is usually entitled to choose to be of a place. Lord, if you're a man, surname, and then of where a place. You choose a place that's significant to you, where you were born, a constituency you represented, where you grew up, whichever place you like. And so that was that. So he was a bit of a folk hero for the Labour Party for sending Roy Jenkins packing. People saw him as a bit of a Judas, or like a second Ramsay MacDonald, for really letting down the Labour Party and splitting it. So Galloway was involved in a charity called War on Want at this time. Another thing to point out is the Afghanistan conflict was raging, well then as it is now. Obviously, there was the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. It was a communist one. The communist wasn't actually in their name. And they're fighting against the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen being this umbrella term for at least 7 different factions, backed up by the Pakistani government, funded by the United States, to a lesser extent the UK. Now, Galloway said he was very much against the Mujahideen, that the UK ought to recognise the Afghan government in Kabul. And the Afghan government was internationally recognised by many countries, including India. The Soviet Union held the United Nations seat for Afghanistan. So, to wit, it was a lawful government. Even if you detested it, it was. And the Soviets had gone in there. Now, admittedly, they killed an Afghan president they find uncongenial and replaced him with someone that they thought they could order about. So Moscow was to be the master puppeteer. Bonjour, Romancy. Do I pronounce it okay? Bonjour. You know, perhaps I'm trying too hard. Am I overthinking it? Anyway, so Galloway said, no, the Mujahideen are evil. And Ron Brown, who was a Labour MP for Edinburgh Leith, I lived in his constituency. Well, my parents had a place in his constituency briefly. Remember what that Labour Party office was? He flew out to Afghanistan in the early 80s to laud the valiant efforts of the Soviet army. He was later deselected in the early 90s. 1992, he left Parliament. Ron Brown was to later rejoin George Galloway's party when Galloway formed the Respect Party. So that was Galloway's position in the late 80s in the Afghan conflict. Actually, the Soviets pulled out in 1989, and the communist statelet they've been propping up managed to struggle on a few more years. People thought it might collapse very fast indeed, but in fact it took about another 5 years. Najibullah, the last president, he hid out in the United Nations compound in Kabul which the Mujahideen wouldn't enter. I think, did he come out, or they finally did, and then he was killed in the most horrendous fashion, not like a shot to the head or something painless, but something really sadistic. Anyway, so Pakistan was still under the military rule at the time. The Chief Martial Law Administrator held sway there, General Muhammad Zia al-Haq, and then his plane was blown up after taking off from Bahawalpur in August 1988. Who killed Zia al-Haq? His enemies were legion. So conspiracy theories abound about this one. The US ambassador was blown up on that. Was who? English or Irish? Ron Brown, Scots, and he's later a taxi driver, complaining that Edinburgh University took too many. You're loving the regular stream, straight white British Protestant. Ron Brown said that Edinburgh University took too many substandard English undergraduates and seemed to discriminate against North British ones, particularly if they were proletarian. Anyway, so Galloway demanded the restoration of democracy in Pakistan, and the surprising thing after Zia al-Haq was blown to Zanat is that everything went according to the constitution. You think there might not be. Who killed him? Well, perhaps I should speculate somewhere else. As I say, the American ambassador was killed on that same flight, so it can't have been the CIA. Conversely, people say it precisely suggests it was the CIA on the basis they said this is a sacrifice has to be made. What better way to cover our tracks? You're behind, Diane Malloy. Well, what do you need to know? But anyway, Benazir Bhutto, the daughter of the man who'd been executed 9 years earlier, the former president, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, she was back in Pakistan. Well, she was let out of prison to lead her party, the Pakistan People's Party, and they won an election victory, and that was that, and she became prime minister and all the rest of it. So, and Galloway, he seemed to get along very well with her, and indeed the other side in Pakistani politics, the Pakistan Muslim League, went out to Pakistan, received all sorts of medals and awards for his supposed role in being the midwife of Pakistani democracy. Well, his rebirth, not birth for the very first time. And he was not shy of reminding the world about these plaudits he'd been handed. Anyway, not one to rest on his laurels, he was also involved in a charity called War on Want, and he was fond of telling about tabloids about his exploits, his supposed promiscuity whilst on War on Want missions. Now, most charities would say, we're just here to try and relieve suffering. We must be apolitical, and charities are not allowed to be explicitly political. Well, this one really skirts the boundary of politics and War on Want, saying we are got to ask, why is there a paucity of necessaries in the world? Why are people malnourished? Why are some people without shelter or electricity or running water or sanitation or decent clothing and schooling and all the rest of it? Why are people deprived of medical care? And say that these are economic issues. I mean, they're also political issues. We can't separate the political from the economic. They overlap, okay? By want, they don't mean desire or wish. They mean the dearth of things you need, the absence of necessities. Someone's talking about San Jose on the comment section. So anyway, the Gulf War came in 1991. You may remember August 1990, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, he invaded Kuwait and claimed he was liberating it. The Emir of Kuwait, that's the king, he hightailed it to Saudi Arabia. Whatever, I appreciate, but you appreciate history whatsoever. Did George Mallory, the alpinist who tried to climb Everest, is always known in England? Well, I've heard of Mallory. Did he die in the attempt in the early 1920s? Well, he's only died on Everest. Did he make it to the top and wasn't able to tell us? Made it almost 30 years before Sir Edmund Hillary. Just possibly he did. Anyway, I'm not into mountaineering, I'm afraid. So back to the situation. So then Kuwait was briefly proclaimed to be the Republic of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and he got a Kuwaiti there. Most people would say he was a marionette, who then, after a month, requested to be allowed to join Iraq, and yes, it was accepted as the 18th province of Iraq. The Iraqis claimed it was historically theirs. They'd also tried the same thing about 30 years earlier, when Kuwait was still a British protectorate, and the United Kingdom had sent troops and warships to ward off the Iraqis, and it had worked. They'd not tried it then. But shortly before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he'd had consultations with the US ambassador to Baghdad, and I think it was a she. She'd said, we have no interest in an Arab conflict such as your dispute with Kuwait. And Saddam took that as the green light to invade Kuwait. He just finished his 8-year war against Iran, emerged with little success or glory, hundreds of thousands of dead, billions of dollars in debt to various countries he couldn't possibly pay off. But so then there was this neutral zone, and there were between Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, and dispute over oil, how much was being pumped here and there. They seized Kuwait. Some people say that Saddam's mistake was to stop there in Kuwait because he had the largest army in the Arab world, battle hardened after 8 years of bitter fighting against the Iranians, and most of the other Arab armies had minimal combat experience and huge amounts of hardware, usually Soviet supplied. And he would have gone like a knife through hot butter, through the Saudi Arabian army, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, into the UAE, into Oman. It would have taken him a month tops. And you know the world's tendency to stop, to just talk forever and hope the problem will go away, takes so long to make a decision, hand-wringing, trying to compromise, water it down to the United Nations. If he acted quickly and decisively, he would have been in an unstoppable position, and the West would have just felt they had to deal with him. Otherwise, oil would have been cut off. But anyway, he stopped in Kuwait, and I won't go through the whole rigmarole of the United Nations resolutions. Jordan neutral because they traded with Iraq so much. Half the Jordanians are Palestinian origin, and Saddam, who was a stalwart of the Palestinian cause, Yemen often on the Iraq side. But anyway, Galloway said, no, we mustn't liberate Kuwait, even though Galloway says, oh, I'm an anti-fascist, I'm an anti-appeaser. Despite all these UN resolutions, despite it being a legal and morally clear-cut case. But anyway, Kuwait was liberated, an awful lot of people were killed. That was that. So Saddam Hussein, in 1991, that February 1991, he signs the armistice, and obviously some of the conditions here are, we'll stop fighting you with the proviso that you give us a full inventory of all your weapons of mass destruction, and you have to destroy these in a verifiable manner, which must be signed off on by United Nations inspectors. And so for the next 12 years, he played cat and mouse with the inspectors, not giving them access to sites, sometimes giving them access, but only after months of delay, and just harassing them, not cooperating, hiding things. He'd given a very full inventory of weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons and so forth. And lots of countries said, yeah, we sold them this stuff. Some stuff was dual use. But that was that. There were UN sanctions on Iraq at the time. So oil was their main export, almost their only export. And they could only sell a limited amount of it, and their money in that could only be spent on food and medicines. The Oil for Food program ought to be called the Oil for Food and Medicine program. But Saddam deliberately withheld comestibles and medicines from his people so that a lot of people were malnourished and a lot of people died avoidably from diseases that could have been cured, but he was withholding medicine and medical equipment from them to try and blame it on foreign countries. And a lot of people fell for this. And just saw these horrifying images of emaciated children or children dying of leukemia when they could have been saved, that he was doing to his own people. So he was at fault. And yes, I mean, it's heartbreaking, some of the images you would see there. But Galloway said that these these sanctions are immoral, must be lifted. He used to hold Galloway in high regard as a man of principles with his opposition to Blair in the Iraq War, but unfortunately I see him as a paid and propagandist. He works for RT, it used to be called Russia Today, but now they just call it RT. I suppose to try and disguise its connection to the Russian state. It isn't obviously Russian state funded, and we're trying to sow discord amongst Western countries, or indeed highlight any hypocrisy, anything scandalous about Western countries, RT America, RT UK, and so forth. And Alex Salmond works for them too. So he was against the sanctions, said they ought to be lifted and things like that. The Kurds, they were freed. They set up Kurdistan, been there since 1991, being a virtually independent state. And it held the referendum and indeed declared independence 2 years ago, the Kurds in the north. They suffered genocide under Saddam Hussein. And the Marsh Arabs in the very south, who tend to be Shia, they'd rebelled unsuccessfully. Right after the Gulf War, February 1991 ended, or should I say Iraq War, well, Gulf War. A lot of people thought that Saddam Hussein would be overthrown. There were mutinies, some of the soldiers turned against him, and the coalition said no fly zone in the very north and the south, no helicopters, no planes. Could he use heavy equipment like tanks and artillery? And the coalition said yes. He was astonished. He thought they said no. And that helped him crush the Marsh Arabs. He wasn't able to crush the Kurdish resistance in the mountains in the north. but that people thought that he would be overthrown by one of his own generals. Actually didn't happen. Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret service, had its eyes and ears everywhere, and he ran a massive terrorist state, as in people living in fear, quaking in fear, will be subjected to the most unimaginably horrific and agonizing tortures if people thought they're plotting against Saddam Hussein, like having limbs dipped in acid and drilling through bones and things like that. And not on a small scale, on an enormous scale. Anyway, so shortly after this, George Galloway went to Saddam Hussein and he saw fit to shake his hand while saying, "Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability," as in it would never tire. And so that's why people have accused Galloway of being a publicist for the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party being the ruling party of Iraq and indeed Syria, meaning the Socialist Party of Arab Resurgence. It's sort of an acronym for it, Ba'ath. It's not Bath. It's with an A, with an apostrophe in the middle of the two A's. So he drove some supplies to Iraq to try and relieve their suffering. And now if the sanctions had been lifted, I suppose their suffering would have been relieved, but also Saddam would have got more oil to spend his WMD program. It now appears that he did actually dismantle the weapons of mass destruction program in the mid-90s, but we didn't know that. People had to assume it was still there because it was such an irrational thing to do. The purpose of having weapons of mass destruction is deterrence, to dissuade anybody else from attacking you. You better not attack us or we're going to drop a nuke on your city. Now, you might defeat us, but is that worth it at the price of several million of people dead? Surely not. Or we can just drench your cities in poison gas or something. Anyway, Galloway's been married, I think it's thrice, to a Palestinian doctor. Once he's got a few children. The Samson option. I think the Samson option was, to bring down the temple with you, even though it kills you. Okay, isn't that the name of the Israeli nuclear weapons program? Now, he has long been a thorn in the side of Israelis. Or shortly before the Iraq War, Dr. Gerard Bull, a weapons expert, was shot dead in Brussels, Belgium, by persons unknown. But Galloway was always blaming it on the Mossad, the Israeli secret service. Galloway also recalled going to South Africa in the late 80s and being in contact with the anti-apartheid people. And he said many of the gallant anti-apartheid activists were Jewish. So he said he's not remotely anti-Semitic, and Jewish people should be and often are against oppression. But sadly, some Jewish people are Zionists and they support the oppression of the Palestinians. So, what else did I say? He wasn't really in sympathy with New Labour, with Tony Blair, George Galloway. So someone else has stolen the limelight from him. He was never liked to see the front bench. He was a maverick, a bit of a one-man band. Actually not very popular in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but I don't think that bothered him over much. Anyway, I suppose not really au fait with Labour's liberalism on homosexuality, for example. I don't think it was anti-gay as such, but it didn't seem to want gay civil partnerships. And didn't like the way that the Labour Party was becoming Tory light, as he would have perceived it. So he was old Labour, hard left, but a bit of a champagne socialist because he was no slouch at charging hefty fees for appearances and journalism. Anyway, so then the run up to the liberation of Iraq in 2003, he was one of the loudest voices saying, "No, we must not do this. This is completely immoral. It'll be cataclysmic. There's no evidence that Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction, and you'll make Al Qaeda even worse." Saying about the Taliban, well, many of these people who later established the Taliban, they've been the Mujahideen, been so generously bankrolled by the CIA back in the 80s. And there is some truth in that. Some of them went on to form the Taliban or Al Qaeda, but we didn't know that in the 1980s how they're going to turn out. But Galloway said, "But I've always been against them." I suppose he prefers a secular socialist dictatorship. Now, I don't like socialist dictatorships, and I do not like religious mania and theocracy. But which is worse? The sort of theocracy the Taliban would bring in is worse. And life is seldom a choice between good and evil. It's often between evil and even worse. So I'm sorry to say that I have to concur with him that life would have been better for the Afghans if the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan had ruled. Brutal though they were, girls could go to school, women didn't have to wear headscarves, could be on television. There was a bit of cosmopolitanism and culture and a bit of joy to life then. They weren't complete killjoys as the Taliban were, or indeed the Mujahideen had been. I know the Mujahideen, they're not all that bad. There's a spectrum, but sorry to say, sort of the mid ground for them is leaning towards theocracy quite heavily. And it's not to say that Islam was banned under the Communist Party in Afghanistan. They began all their announcements with the Islamic incantation, Bismillah ur-Rahman ur-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So 2003, the liberation of Iraq commenced on the 19th of March that year, and he was a day one detester of George W. Bush, saying, I misunderestimate him. Obviously an allusion to one of Bush's malapropisms. You can read about this in the Bush Dyslexicon, a book of the dozens of moronic things that George W. Bush said. So anyway, early in the Iraq War, Galloway said, where are the Arab armies? They're the only ones fighting legally. He called upon the British army to disobey illegal orders, claiming it was an illegal war. And it was expelled from the Labour Party for inciting British soldiers to mutiny. It wasn't prosecuted for sedition or anything. And that was that. So the Daily Telegraph was in Baghdad just after it was freed from Saddam's bloody reign of terror. And they're going through various documents in the Iraqi Ministry of Oil. And they came across a document which said payments to people in the United Kingdom. And it said one of these was George Galloway. And they published this. The journalist, I think it was called Ian Blair, actually, no relation to Tony Blair. But so Galloway then sued them for libel. And he won his case. He won a payout of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Could this have been a hoax? I don't know. This document, and that was that. So therefore, it's not proven that he did accept any payments from the Iraqi government, legal or illegal. What's the next thing? Yeah, he formed the Respect Party, which was for old-style socialism, state ownership of swathes of the economy, high taxation on the wealthy, high welfare payments, striving to keep unemployment down, and can't think what else, getting rid of nuclear weapons, disengagement from all sorts of foreign wars, leaving NATO, and so on. I'm not sure about leaving the EU, actually. Environmentalism, respect for civil liberties, as in less spying, Blair turned the country into a surveillance state. I remember in the first couple of years after 9/11, some people were interned without trial in the UK. Selma Yaqub, a Muslim solicitor from Birmingham, she was his number 2 in the party. So I got a few local councillors. Anyway, then in 2005, in Bethnal Green and Bow, a London seat with lots of Muslims, Galloway was narrowly elected. He defeated Una King, the Labour incumbent, and Jeremy Paxman interviewed him saying, you know, you said that you support black women. You've just kicked out of Parliament one of the very few black women in Parliament. And he's saying, well, Jeremy, could you not find it in your heart to congratulate me on my victory? Well, Paxman said it was a fantastic victory because, you know, you've got to be one of the major parties to win, really. And obviously in Scotland, the SNP is a major party of Plaid Cymru. Northern Ireland's different from the rest of the UK. But, you know, in Great Britain, you've got to be one of the 4 major parties, let's say. Someone from a minor party like the Respect Party hadn't won in decades. So it was a phenomenal accomplishment. Even though I loathe him mostly, I have to hand it to him for managing that. And they say there was a lot of asperity beyond the usual rough and tumble of an election. These can be fractious affairs. They met at the police station, supposedly to have some sort of truce. Not saying anyone was killed in this tightly fraught and tightly fought election. Anyhow, so he was in Parliament for a while, but when he won in the Bethnal Green and Bow, his acceptance speech was a marvel to behold, saying, Mr. Blair, this one's for Iraq, and for the tens of thousands you've slaughtered across the globe in your bloody reign of terror. Something like that. I can't quite get it like that. So many more things. He lost that seat in the next election in 2010. He decided that's a great impression. Thank you so very much. Straight white British prod. He then stood for Bradford North at a by-election about 2011, and he won. He said the Bradford Spring has begun. Now Bradford is colloquially known. Galloway converted to Islam. I didn't know about that. He converted. Bradford is known as Bradistan, has the largest Pakistani community in the United Kingdom. He's only about 30% Pakistani, but in one constituency is rather higher than that. And those who are not Pakistanis, quite a lot of them are Muslims. There are white British people with a Christian background there as well. But anyway, and he said, well, I'm more of a Muslim than my so-called Muslim opponent since I've always abstained from alcohol. He said that spirituous liquor has a most deleterious effect on a person. Anyway, so he managed to win there as well, but again, he lost that seat in the subsequent general election. Seems to be the life cycle of those who win at a by-election, usually a one-hit wonder if they come from a minor party. He proclaimed Bradford to be an Israeli-free zone, but some Israelis went and posed with the Israeli flag by the Bradford sign at the entrance of the city to show that we are here. They accuse him of anti-Semitism. He's been dogged by these persistent allegations. So, he was an outspoken admirer of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks fame. Julian Assange is now detained in the United Kingdom because he skipped bail, got a 12-month sentence. But in this country, you'll be released after half of that at most, probably more like 4 months. But plenty of time for extradition proceedings to be commenced in order to send him to the United States, where he's wanted for various charges. Anyhow, so there was Julian Assange was wanted for questioning in Sweden on allegations of rape. Did he supposedly he had some consensual sex with some woman, but then she didn't want him to have sex again and he did it anyway, or did he not use a condom when he wanted her to do so? Something like that. Anyway, the Swedish police, why couldn't they question him in London? Why didn't have to go to Sweden to do that? But Assange was worried he'd be extradited to the United States and thrown into Gitmo or Supermax or something. Because, you know, that absolute witch, what's that moronic woman who looks like a hot teacher called Sarah Palin? That's the one, okay. She's sort of like a female Trump. But anyway, saying that Assange should be hunted down like bin Laden. Now, Assange, well, you know, you can't steal tens of thousands of highly classified documents and expect to get clean away with it. But he is not on the level of bin Laden. He's not killed anyone. He's not suggested killing anyone. He has exposed some war crimes. Okay, these were the Iraq War diaries that when the US military had deliberately killed civilians, large numbers of civilians on multiple occasions, and nothing been done about it. I'm not impugning the honor of the US military as a whole. I'm not saying that most soldiers were complicit in this, but a significant number were. Okay, this is not the de minimis range. You expect that bad things to be done in war. He compromised US national security. Well, they said they redacted documents to make sure that no names or identifying information came out. And Assange said, supposing there was a binary choice, we'd have to reveal all or nothing, then we would still reveal all. So let me see. I think I'm going to have to wind up now because someone might need to speak to me on Skype. I might continue a little bit later. Okay, that's all for the moment on